uprising. The United Kingdom marked 20 years since the deadly 7/7 London bombings. King Charles has paid tribute to the courage and compassion shown that day. He called on Britons to stand united against hate. Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Mayor Sadiq Khan laid wreaths at Hyde Park at 8:50 a.m., the time the first bomb exploded. A national service followed at St. Paul's Cathedral. Survivors, police, and rescue workers gathered to honor the lives lost. 52 people died, over 770 were injured. Starmer said those who tried to divide us failed. The attack remains a defining moment in Britain's modern history. Now we are joined by Berzin Bakmar. He's a foreign affairs expert joining us live from London. Thank you, Berzin, for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. How do public commemorations like the one on the today or the 20th anniversary of 7/7 bombings contribute to national unity and healing after such a tragedy?
It is a moment of national grief, and therefore healing is inevitable. And as the government has been at pains to show that there is a question of social cohesion and that divisive, disruptive forces will not rent asunder the social fabric of Britain, which is all very well and indeed is expected and welcome from any government, not just Britain as such. But the question is, 20 years on, the threats from such terrorism are far more unpredictable and diverse. That has to be also squarely placed on record, because while the original nature of the threat as an Al-Qaeda trained bombers of Pakistani descent, Britons who undertook this act, remains as such, there has now been a question of lone wolf attacks also, which have mutated in the last 20 years. We've seen not just in England, but also elsewhere. And then there's also the question of governments across Europe and Britain believe that attacks are also in the offing from hard right elements, non-Muslim hard right elements. And that is true and has to be factored in. But for all purposes and intents, all governments, including London, still note that the threat from Islamism remains a clear and present danger. That needs to be also pointed out as such.
And Wakmar, in what ways can leaders' messages such as King Charles' call to stand united against hate influence public attitude towards tolerance and social cohesion, according to you?
Well, social cohesion and tolerance is already inevitably evident in the British system, because the government and various agencies are at pains to point that out. But what needs to be done on the part of government now, insofar as I'm concerned, is to assess the nature and evolving trend of the threats. And for example, as I just mentioned about the 20-year period, we've seen different threats involved. Now there is a question, of course, not just of what we may broadly just tar brush as Islamism, but also threats from state actors. Most noticeably, Iran in recent times, even before the so-called 12-day war and its involvement in the Gaza conflict. For example, we have just had arrests undertaken in Britain just before the latest flashpoint between Iran and Israel of illegal Iranian migrants who arrived on boats and were willing to carry out terrorist threats against Iranian dissidents on British soil. That is to say, Iranians resident here who were being targeted by the Iranian regime in Tehran. And 4 individuals have been arrested. We've also arrested, for example, Iranians here who have sought asylum and were planning, and this was noted by the security services, their arrest recently, for attacking the Israeli embassy in London. The plan was in its advanced stages and it had to be nipped, and they were arrested as such. These were just 2 threats, but then there is also the question of what the Home Office has passed recently. Just last week, the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, where individuals would be proscribed who seek to actively act on part of a foreign state. it had been done with Iran in mind, but of course, Russia and China are not any far trailing behind in that threat as such. Then there is the question also of agencies and other apparatuses of influence who work from other governments. In 2023, the Islamic Center of England was shut down as a charity by Tehran. It was, for all purposes and intents, a body that was acting on part of the Rahbar or the Faqih, the Ayatollah Khamenei as the supreme leader's mouthpiece. And it had come in under the watch view of the Charity Commission here in England, and its activities were not compatible with its so-called charity status. And of course, instead of coming under the Charity Commissioner's purview, Tehran decided to pull the rug and close it down. That was one, you could say, minor victory we achieved. But then there are other such bodies who seek to influence. And of course, there's the question now of virulent anti-Semitism that has taken root in England because of the Gaza war. And such agencies seek to capitalize on such aspects. And of course, you know, as you mentioned, disrupt social cohesion within the population.
And Wagmar, last but not least, what lessons can be learned from, you've already kind of touched down on this, but response to the 7/7 bombings about resilience and community in face of terrorism?
Well, insofar as the intelligence and security services are concerned, not to mention bases in technology that have been evolved over the last 20 years, we are much more vigilant. In terms of communications also and other such means, we have far more sophisticated methods of intercepting and also nipping such aspects of heinous crimes in the stages of planning as such. But then there is also the question, and I must point out here, the question of minority Britons being involved in assisting the security and intelligence services too, including British Muslims who have taken it upon themselves and are assisting the security and intelligence services and have done so at considerable risk to themselves too in intercepting such potential acts. That also must be placed on record and has occurred in the last 20 years. Needless to state, it is not something that is amplified for the most obvious of reasons due to they undertake such acts at great peril to themselves, but it needs to be placed on record.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much, Berzin Wagmar, for joining us today and sharing your insight as foreign affairs expert. Today we are honored to speak with Mustafa Kurtuloglu. He's a courageous survivor of the 7/7 bombings who lived through one of the darkest moments. And now his story we will bring you. He's live with us today. Thank you for joining us, Mustafa Kurtuldu. He's 7/7 bombing survivor, joining us live from London.
Hi, Hayden.
Welcome to NewsX World. As we reflect on 2 decades since that day, what memories, if any, still stand out vividly from those initial moments on the train, according to you? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I live through it most days, to be honest. You know, I was on my way to work, not on a journey I would normally take, and then got on the train at Liverpool Street. Then halfway through between Liverpool Street and Aldgate Station, the blast happened. We were stuck on the train for about 45 minutes, and eventually rescue workers came and helped us off the train. You know, it's a weird, like, talking about it. It's fine, but like, there's 2 documentaries which I featured on, one for Sky TV in the UK and one on Netflix. So watching those things are very difficult, especially like hearing the sirens all over again. But you know, I mean, there were moments of positivity. There were 2 like ladies who helped me that day, who were like my angels, as it were. And you know, and Londoners all together pretty much came together afterwards, you know, to say that we will not be beaten, because it affects everyone, wherever your background.
And Mustafa, you've answered or told us how vividly you still remember even after 2 decades, and how was that day 2 decades ago how has that day shaped your outlook on life and the community?
So I mean, there's a few like the more practical things is like I'm affected by it on a regular basis. I still have um, manic episodes where I don't want to speak to anyone or like I zone out. There's physical things that still affect me. In terms of the more other stuff, your worldview of things change, like the way you because you paint the brush of like the journalism world or like the press, but then like newspapers I wouldn't have expected to be very helpful and kind were, and then vice versa. And so that those sorts of things change your worldview. And also, I suppose, like you start to understand why people might have biases towards different minority groups. And you try to empathize with them when normally you probably wouldn't. You think you put box people into good and bad. Um, and trying to keep open-minded about why people might dislike Muslims or Islam, and you try to sort of talk to those people as much as possible. Uh, Emphasize the fact that this is a small minority within a minority, and don't represent the whole. And most of us want to live in a peaceful way. And so just, and then obviously opportunities like this to speak to yourselves, like it's like a huge privilege, to speak to like news channels around the world and just making sure that the positive side of Islam is shown, not like this hijacked version. And so, those are the things which I suppose I've taken away from it. I've been very lucky to live through it. I've been very lucky not to be severely injured, although psychologically, it's hard to really fathom. But yeah.
Yes, and Mustafa, how have you observed public safety and security measures evolve after that from your perspective as a survivor?
I mean, like, if you're seen as a Muslim, obviously you'll be affected or treated relatively negatively. Like anyone with a beard and a rucksack doesn't have to be Muslim, but just fits the archetype. Like anyone with a turban was treated very suspiciously, which is bad. But then you have to understand people's prejudices are based on fear, and people don't have the time and opportunity to like think about those things rationally. But over time, people are becoming a bit more measured. But then on the flip side, like last year, there was a fundamentalist Christian who murdered three little girls, schoolgirls, and then social media people may said that they were Muslims, and so Muslims were attacked even though it had nothing to do with Muslim extremism. And so sometimes it feels there's like a back and forth. I think generally speaking, people are much more rational, but then social media is very, very risky as it can just set something off like that. So you always have to be very careful. I think fact checking and the authorities to really release statements is really important. But what can you do? Things happen very quickly.
And Mustafa, now building on your answers, as we mark this significant anniversary or day, what message, if any, would you hope resonates with our viewers about finding hope in the wake of such tragedy?
I say, like talk to your neighbors, like remember that we're one family, we're one human race. It's important that you don't let any form of extremism, wherever it comes from, allow it to fester. Always fight back in a respectful fashion, and know that amongst them are always good people. It's like just tarring one community that you are sold as this is the enemy. It's not necessarily the case. That you have more in common with each other, and come to common terms between each other. That's the message I have.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And your story of resilience and hope reminds us of the strength of the human spirit even in the face of tragedy. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your experience. Mustafa Kurtuldu, he's a 7/7 bombing survivor, and he joined us live from London. Now we move on to our next news. The Kremlin